Okay, welcome everyone to this third session of the ASILE Project annual conference, Global Asylum Governance and the European Union's Role. My name is Roberto Cortinovis. I'm a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, and I will be the moderator of this session, which is titled EU External Asylum Governance on Arrangements with Third Countries. So the prominence assigned to cooperation with third countries in EU migration and asylum policy has been recently confirmed by the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum presented last September. The Pact clearly states that migration should become a key issue in EU relationship with third countries. To this end, comprehensive and tailor-made partnerships should be established, covering all relevant aspects of migration and asylum. While the Commission states that the EU should take a fresh look at its priorities with third countries, the approach laid down in the Pact continues and even reinforces a number of dynamics that have shaped EU external action over the past years. In line with the partnership framework under the EU Agenda on Migration, the Pact relies on a conditionality approach, mobilizing all relevant policies and tools available to the EU and its member states to increase cooperation in the field of readmission. Second, it puts a strong emphasis on the mobilization of EU external funding to address the root causes of forced displacement and support countries hosting large numbers of refugees. Finally, and most relevant for today's discussion, the Pact confirms the drive for flexible and tailor-made non-legally binding arrangements with third countries covering mobility and asylum aspects. So in today's panel, we are going to look at the landscape of EU external asylum governance through the lens of refugee containment and mobility, which underpin ASILE research agenda, and of course, in light of the Global Compact on refugees and its implementation. We are going to focus specifically on arrangements with third countries, exploring their key features and assessing their impacts on fundamental rights, democratic accountability, as well as their broader consequences for EU external relations. I would like now to introduce our speakers today, who include researchers who are part of the ASILE network, but also external experts who have contributed to the ASILE blog on the new Pact on Migration over the previous months by discussing developments related to external asylum policy from different thematic and geographical perspectives. So I'm going to present our speakers briefly. We will first have four core presentations. Our first speakers will be Thomas Spikeboard, Professor of Migration Law at the University of Amsterdam. Our second speakers will then be Nicolas Veit-Tan, Senior Researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Our third speakers will be Meltem İneli, Assistant Professor at the Süleyman Demirel University in Turkey. And finally, our fourth speakers will be Mehari Tadelemaro, Professor at the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute in Florence. After our speakers' interventions, which will last around 10 minutes each, I will give the floor to our discussants for their comments and observations. We are very glad to have with us today three discussants. Tsion Tadesse Abebe, Senior Researcher in the Migration Program of the Institute for Security Studies in Ethiopia. Our second discussant will then be Amanda Bizong, Policy Officer at the European Center for Development Policy Management in the Netherlands. And finally, our last discussant will be Eleni Karageorgiou, who is postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Law at Lund University in Sweden. As our discussants are supposed to speak for around 7 minutes each, we will then have the time for an interactive discussion with the audience. And in view of this, I would like to invite you to use the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar. When you type your question, you may also want to indicate to whom of our panelists you would like to address your question. So as you see, we have a very rich panel with 7 presentations. So this implies that we will also need to be quite careful with time keeping. So without any further ado, I would like to turn to our first speaker, Professor Thomas Spikeboard from University of Amsterdam, and he's also leading ASILE research on EU arrangements and cooperation with third countries. Thomas, in your contribution, you are going to focus on the normative framework within which your arrangements with third countries take place. And just to introduce this topic, in your contribution on the ASILE blog, you point out how the opposition of countries in Africa and Asia towards EU migration control policies have not only to do with the negative economic and social impact of those policies on those societies, but may also reflect a deeper disagreement on the foundational principles of international migration law between Europe, the EU, and those countries. So, Thomas, we look forward to your intervention. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Roberto. As we know, and as we've heard during earlier sessions of this conference, cooperation with non-EU countries is a cornerstone of European migration and asylum policy. And I indeed would like to use my 10 minutes for the normative framework within which these arrangements between the EU and non-EU countries take place. Now, at a very general level, it deserves attention that European states and non-European states do not necessarily agree about the foundational principles of international migration law. An important example of this is about the question whether states have to justify which immigrants it does not want to allow to come in, or whether a justification is not necessary. So is justification of exclusion necessary? In Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, the foundational principle of international migration law holds that as a matter of well-established international law, states have the right to control the entry of non-nationals into its territory. This is a quote I take from standard case law of the European Court of Human Rights. And from this principle, these global north states conclude that states are free to exclude foreign nationals and they don't have to justify this exclusion under international law. And then subsequently, by way of exception, foreigners can justify that they, in their individual cases, cannot be excluded, most notably by relying on the prohibition of refoulement, asylum law, and the right to family life. Marie-Bénédicte Dambour has called this the Strasbourg reversal, Bas Schotel calls it exclusion without justification, and Daniel Thume calls it the fundamental principle of sedentarism. So that's the European position. However, regional human rights supervisory bodies in other parts of the world do not necessarily share this foundational principle. The African Commission of Human and People's Rights considers expulsion as an infringement of the right to property, the right to work, the right to education, the right to family life, and the right to equality, and potentially also as an infringement of the right to an effective remedy, as well as of the prohibitions of mass expulsions and refoulement. And these infringements may be justified, but justification is needed. Only after addressing this, the African Commission acknowledges that states can take legal action against undocumented migrants. So the Commission puts the burden of justification for exclusion with the state, instead of putting the burden of justification for non-exclusion with individuals. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has ruled more extensively on this. And as a consequence of its case law, it holds that distinctions based on nationality and migration status need justification. So the Inter-American Court includes migration status as a prohibited discrimination ground. And so these African and Inter-American approaches contrast with the European position. Of course, one should not overstate this contrast, because the European version, as I just said, allows for justification of claims to inclusion, while the African and Inter-American systems allow for the justification of exclusion. But if one notices the amount of work that the Strasbourg reversal does in the case law on border detention, on jurisdiction, on family reunion, on asylum, this contrast between the European and the African and Inter-American position makes quite a difference. And you can also see this on very concrete points. An important example of such a concrete issue is the readmission of nationals and of non-nationals who transited through countries neighboring the EU. In the Migration Pact, which the Commission presented in September, the Commission proposes to impose sanctions on third countries, on non-European countries that don't cooperate sufficiently on the readmission of their own nationals, as well as with the readmission of non-nationals. The European Union apparently assumes that those countries are obliged to readmit their own nationals, as well as others who transited through their countries. However, this idea that states are obliged to readmit their own nationals is dubious. Of course, everyone has the right to return to their own country, but this is a right that an individual has vis-à-vis their own state. And it is not subject to doubt that this right or obligation, if you look at it from the perspective of the state, it's not subject to doubt that this right/obligation exists between individuals and their own states, between these two entities. However, it's not at all obvious that others have standing to invoke this right or obligation. To use a financial example, if I owe Nick Tan, who is the next speaker on this panel, 100 euros, it is not obvious that Meltem, the speaker after Nick, can force me to pay Nick if Nick says that he doesn't insist. Because it's a right and obligation that are between Nick and me, and Meltem is a third party who has no involvement in this. In a similar manner, a Tunisian national has a right to return to Tunisia, which he can exercise vis-à-vis Tunisia, and Tunisia has a duty towards that Tunisian national to readmit. But that does not mean that France can force Tunisia to readmit that Tunisian if the Tunisian would rather remain in France. Arguably, it is the sovereign right of Tunisia to decide how it relates to its own citizens within the limits of human rights law, and if the Tunisian doesn't want to return, these limits are not exceeded. In addition to this, it's the sovereign right of Tunisia to decide who are its citizens and who are not its citizens. Other countries have no right to interfere in this. That's a standard, a classic element of international law. However, just think of the European practice to claim one single person in several third countries, so in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, or think of the practice to reject an asylum application because the nationality of the applicant has not been established, but then to ask Ethiopia to issue a laissez-passer, to accept this person as a citizen. This sheds a very uneasy light on the complaints of European countries about lack of cooperation of non-European countries with readmitting their nationals. So, when European states insist that countries of origin have a duty to readmit their own nationals, also if that national does not want to return, I'm not sure that countries of origin have to agree or actually do agree. I will not go into the duty to readmit non-nationals who travel through a country, but the basis of such an obligation is even more dubious. Of course, readmission agreements may change the legal relations between countries. So if France and Tunisia conclude a readmission agreement, that changes, but these agreements do not by themselves change international customary law. Now, you might find such observations legal sophistries, formalists, nonsensical, ivory tower perspectives. However, just think of the suddenly very nuanced position that European countries take when it comes to readmitting their own nationals. In several European countries, nationals held in camps in Kurdish-dominated parts of Syria, these nationals that are in Syria have litigated so as to be allowed and to be assisted to return to their own country of nationality. And now suddenly European courts have used legal argumentation that one could at least call innovative so as to limit or even deny that right. And I just learned that a case against France has been referred by the chamber to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights on this issue. This is a stark example of, and stark element of this case law in European countries is that domestic courts hold that their own nationals are not within the jurisdiction of their own state of nationality because they are not on their territory. Now, we know that that is a standard, let's say, starting point of international law on jurisdiction. But if you apply this to nationals trying to return to your own country, saying that they are not within your jurisdiction because they are not on the territory denies the right to return to one's own country of nationality any effective meaning, because that right will by definition be invoked by people who are not on the territory of their state of nationality. So I'm not the only one to engage in legal observations that one might find artificial. Back to the duty to admit nationals and non-nationals. My intention in this panel is not to argue which position on the duty to readmit nationals as well as non-nationals is the better one. I limit myself to pointing out that European external migration policy treats fundamental issues as obvious that are not obvious at all. North African countries, Turkey, or sub-Saharan African countries may very well have, and I think actually do have, different normative positions that are just as coherent and just as valid as the European ones. If European cooperation with third countries is to be seen as legitimate, and even if Europe merely wants its own cooperation to be somewhat effective, these divergent normative positions are something to reflect on instead of simply to ignore. Thank you.
Thanks, thanks a lot, Thomas, for your intervention. I think reflecting on the normative ideas about how migration is framed in international law and underlying how international legal norms can be interpreted and can be based on different normative frameworks, can lead to different understanding of how these international legal norms are indeed understood, and also implying that the perspective that we take for granted here in Europe is not cannot necessarily be shared in other traditions, in other normative tradition. I think it's a very good starting point for our discussion, and it set the tone very well of our discussion today. So I would like now to turn to our second presenter, Nicholas Veit Tan, senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. So Nick, you have a new publication that is out on the ASILE website, which is titled Inventory and Typology of EU Arrangements with Third Countries. The study provides an in-depth analysis and legal assessment of EU arrangements with a group of third countries, Turkey, Niger, Tunisia, and Serbia. So I would like to ask you to tell us more about the findings of this research and also the implications of these arrangements for EU cooperation with third countries. So Nick, I give you the floor.
Thanks, Roberto, and thanks, Thomas. I would have loved to be together in Amman, but here we are in my bedroom instead. As Roberto has mentioned, available on the ASILE website now is a new working paper co-authored with Jens Vestel Hansen. It looks at the dynamics of EU arrangements with selected third countries through the pillars, if you like, of containment on the one hand and mobility on the other, and of course, in light of the Global Compact on refugees. And what I'm going to present to you today is some early findings of our first period of work. And I should say at the outset, I think that it's important to note that this is a desk study. This is a study that's been limited by the pandemic. And in some ways, the findings are somehow synthetic or sort of two-dimensional. And it's really important to emphasize that the next phase of this research, led by Thomas, will be in the field, assessing the dynamics and adding the sort of three-dimensionality to what I'm presenting to today. So this study, engaging on EU arrangements with Turkey, Serbia, Niger, and Tunisia, focused on arrangements since 2015, and focused on 3 Global Compact objectives: easing pressure on host countries, enhancing refugee self-reliance, and expanding access to third country solutions. And we can return to this in our Q&A on sort of a more critical approach to these rather vague objectives. But what I'm going to present to you is, I guess, 3 substantive conclusions. Firstly, on the preponderance of informal cooperation between the EU and these third states since the seminal year of 2015. Secondly, the very clear focus on containment in EU policymaking as the major shareholder in EU approaches here. And thirdly, a lack of Global Compact mainstreaming in these third country arrangements, a general lack of uptake of the compacts thus far at least. And finally, what I'm going to do in my 10 minutes is point to some outstanding questions for further research, both for the ASILE project and perhaps for other asylum governance scholars at large. But firstly then, to look at this question of informality in EU arrangements. So I can share with you that of the really rather dizzying gamut of arrangements with these 4 selected countries that we mapped in this working paper, only one instrument is explicitly legally binding, and that is, of course, the status agreement between the EU and Serbia with respect to Frontex operations on Serbian territory. So telling that the one legally binding document is clearly focused on migration management and return. And this, of course, this informalization trend is a clear continuation in both broader EU external relations, but perhaps particularly asylum policy. And the concern here, of course, is the tendency for EU policy to be conducted beyond the limits of binding law, or at least seemingly so, through the use of informal arrangements like the EU-Turkey statement, designed to avoid the triggering of substantive EU law and potentially placing EU activities beyond legal protections. We argue, of course, that such informality further weakens both transparency and accountability within the EU legal order. And in addition, and in parallel, such arrangements create parallel concerns under general international law. And here, of course, Gregor Knoll's references to questions of attribution and responsibility in the previous panel could come to light. Simultaneously with informalization, then we saw that EU instruments are increasingly carried out by actors that are more and more varied in scope. So while EU agencies like EASO and Frontex are, of course, physically present in a number of these third country arrangements, notably Serbia, EU financial instruments also fund a really dizzying array of international organizations, including IOM and UNHCR, and international and national NGOs as implementing partners. So while this working paper goes some way towards mapping this work, there is definitely more work to be done. And it's worth noting here, I think, that among these sort of huge spectrum of financial instruments, there is relatively little focus on strengthening national asylum systems, which of course goes to Thomas's point about effectiveness in EU asylum policy. Secondly, then, EU arrangements with Turkey, Serbia, Niger, and Tunisia show a perhaps obvious predominant focus on containment. Now, Jens Wessel Hansen set out quite usefully yesterday, I think, that mobility, of course, can be understood in at least 2 ways. It can first be understood in external terms, that is the ability or mobility to cross the international border to seek asylum. And of course, we can discuss internal mobility in relation to freedom of movement within a host state. So with respect to external mobility first, of course, while some of the Global Compact's suite of so-called third country solutions, that is resettlement and complementary pathways, are present in some of these EU arrangements, they remain relatively small scale and often ad hoc in nature. And it's really notable here, I think, that these limited external mobility policies are often embedded in broader containment approaches. The one-for-one concept under the EU-Turkey statement is perhaps the classic example, as well as the emergency transit mechanism in Niger, which of course is inherently tied to EU policy in supporting push and pullbacks in Libya. And this of course has been described by Roberto and Sergio as a dynamic of contained mobility. But with respect to the internal mobility side within the host state, it's worth noticing or making note of Niger's law on migrant smuggling, which has de facto criminalized the movement of third country nationals in the north of Niger. And of course, Thomas has characterized these controls as internal carrier sanctions. And finally, in the working paper, we have a focus on the ability of access to of asylum seekers to access protection in these third states, given that these external mobility options remain fairly rare and fairly small scale. Now here we need some further research to make definitive findings on access to asylum, but our work does indicate that current EU arrangements fail to allow access to international protection. So there are obviously significant questions over Turkey and whether Turkey and Serbia, for example, can lawfully be considered a safe third country under both EU and international law. In Niger and Tunisia, on the other hand, there is little uptake of national protection, while in Tunisia specifically, there is simply no current national asylum system, foreclosing the possibility of gaining protection in the country. My final substantive point returns to this sort of GCR universal level to try to assess the extent to which the GCR is read in or written into these third country arrangements. And quite simply, at present, EU arrangements do not reflect significant engagement with the objectives of the GCR I spelled out earlier. Of course, I think it's fair to note here that the GCR does remain a relatively new instrument, and its implementation has certainly been disrupted by the current pandemic. Nevertheless, we do argue that the non-binding and generality of the GCR's objectives may have contributed to a sort of tendency limiting the Compact's impact on EU arrangements to date. Just for example, the GCR is not referred to in EU publications on the arrangements that I've spelled out above, nor is the language of the GCR present used in key instruments such as the EU Trust Fund for Africa or the Madad Fund. So in sum, while there is some clear overlap between EU arrangements and the GCR objectives, substantial alignment with the Compact is not in place. Finally, then, to consider areas for further research that is sitting on my desk. The first, of course, is to understand the dynamics of these actors and instruments that I've set out for you today. As I've mentioned, this desk study is the starting point. It essentially reflects the state of the art in literature and a sort of update since in EU policy in this area since 2015. But clearly a much more important task is to investigate the dynamics between instruments and actors on the ground. And this important work will be undertaken by national researchers in these 4 countries. Secondly, there is a need, I think, to conceptualize the relationship between the mobility pathways I've outlined and that are so much put forward under the GCR and spontaneous asylum on the other hand. And here I was very much inspired by Audrey Macklin's warnings yesterday of the use of legal pathways to offset containment approaches, as she put it, by stealth attempting to replace an asylum system with a resettlement system. And relatedly, of course, it's important that we interrogate what we mean when we talk about mobility. As Professor Macklin said, if permission to move means mobility, then this is a very thin form of human agency. And finally, then, to turn to some current and potential legal issues that need to be unpacked by us in future. Of course, there are some well-known legal issues here. The EU-Turkey statement has given rise to significant legal contestation. The question of EU financial instruments under procurement law, the status agreement with respect to Serbia and Frontex operations on territory. But perhaps more broadly, further research is required to understand the applicability of international human rights law, refugee law, and EU standards to these arrangements. We note in closing that the GCR is of course a non-binding document, but explicitly grounded in the binding international law standards of the 1951 Convention and its 1967 Protocol. So here I will recall Catherine Costello's intervention in the previous session on the under-recognized and contested human rights at play, and of course, Gregor's plans to research questions of international state and organization responsibility in this context. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Nick, for your intervention, for this detailed overview of some of the main features of arrangements with our countries, and also for linking very well with the theoretical and conceptual framework of asile by pointing to the relation of between containment and mobility aspects in this arrangement, and the fact that the mobility aspects are and looks like embedded into a broader framework of containment, and this of course impacts on both the quality and scope of these mobility opportunities that are granted in the framework of these arrangements, and also of course for pointing out avenues of future research, the future research agenda that will be implemented in the future years of this project. So I turn now to our third speaker, Professor Meltem İneli from Demirel University in Turkey. So Meltem, in your intervention, you are going to focus on a specific instrument or arrangements, the EU-Turkey statement, which was concluded in March 2016, so precisely 5 years ago. And the statement has for sure been one of the most visible elements of EU external action on migration since its adoption. So we are very interested to have an assessment of your assessment of the outcomes of the statement at this specific point in time. But also maybe you can reflect on the extent to which current proposals under the new pact may represent an attempt to mainstream practices and instruments that have been first developed under the statement. So Meltem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. Good afternoon all from Turkey. It is a pleasure to be speaking in this distinguished panel. Today I'll be talking about, as Roberto mentioned, particularly about the EU-Turkey statement. My presentation is actually based on a piece that we have written with Orçun Ulusoy from Refugee University of Amsterdam, titled "Why the EU-Turkey Statement Should Never Serve as a Blueprint," and it is published as part of the ASILE Forum, but now I believe it is also published as part of the ASILE book. So compatibility of the agreed measures under the EU-Turkey statement with its international and European refugee law and human rights law standards has been widely questioned and criticized by academia and civil society. It is widely written. The European Parliament in 2016 noted that outsourcing is not a credible long-term solution, yet it has been more than 5 years since the statement has been adopted, as Roberto just mentioned. In the limited time that I have, I will try to outline the main legal problems with the EU-Turkey statement, mention a very few positive outcomes of the statement, and then I will also try to identify a number of lessons which can be drawn from the EU-Turkey statement. I personally believe lesson learning and lesson drawing is quite important, because although the EU-Turkey statement can be accepted as a first, it will certainly not be the last. When you read the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, you realize that the EU will continue cooperating with third countries and externalizing migration management. And I believe there are precious lessons to be learned from the EU-Turkey statement, in particular, what not to replicate in the future. So I will try to share my PowerPoint, perhaps, hopefully successfully. Let me see. Yes, here you go. Okay, so in the last panel, Gregor called the EU's Turkey statement as a mess, and I agree. There are clear legal problems with it. And as Nick just mentioned a while ago, we don't know whose statement is it still after 5 years. The authorship and the legal nature of the statement have been much contested. It was released on the European Council website as a press release, and the European Commission constantly releases information and publishes implementation reports of the statement. So we all know that in actual state, the EU is behind this statement, but we see court judgments from the ECJ and the European Court of Human Rights mentioning that this is an instrument concluded between the heads of member states and Turkey. So this way, with these judgments, the EU becomes not an author of the statement. Therefore, the statement remains outside of checks and balances of EU law, in the words of Sergio. And the EU becomes not responsible for breaches arising out of the arrangements concluding under the EU-Turkey statement. So a lesson which can be drawn from this is next future instruments between EU and third countries in the area of migration should not be in the form of soft law. They should be concrete hard law instruments, and EU should cite it as an explicit author of future agreements. Second point, the Commission advertises the statement as a success because it managed to decrease the number of irregular arrivals from Turkey to Greece. And we asked with Orçun, is this objective realized? Here in my presentation in the left-hand side, there are UNHCR figures, which I obtained a few days ago. And here you will see there is substantial decrease from 1 million in 2015 to 95,000 arrivals. So there is considerable decrease in the number of irregular arrivals to the EU. But as Thomas mentioned in a publication a few years back, we don't know the extent to which the statement actually played a role in this decrease, because there may be other factors which need to be considered, such as border closures in the Balkans and between EU member states, media campaigns to deter new arrivals, the right to work being given to Syrians in 2016 after the statement. So we need comprehensive and objective and reliable research done on the extent to which actually the EU-Turkey statement has managed to decrease the number of irregular arrivals to the EU. And this is, I think, quite an important gap in literature. So the third legal problem with the EU-Turkey statement is that together with the hotspot approach adopted by the EU Commission, it created a legal limbo for those who have a right to Greek islands. And when you look at the conditions, the reception conditions in the Greek islands, I'm sure you have read about the Moria campfires. And when you look at the UNHCR brief of this month, you still realize that thousands of refugees and asylum seekers in the Greek islands live in tents in freezing conditions, and these are inhumane conditions. And this is after 5 years of the statement. And this is a continuing limbo. And what I argue about the lesson learned from this is future statements, future third country agreements should not take containment policies and pro-reception conditions as a central component of such instruments and such cooperation agreements. Another problematic issue relating to the EU statement, in our opinion, is the return and readmission is at the center of the statement. So return and readmission is being used as an element to deter new arrivals to Greece and from Turkey. So there is a clear legally problematic aspect of the statement, which has been voiced by many authors. This is not something new that I'm telling you today. So we still don't know if Turkey can be accepted as a safe third country or a first country of asylum under EU law, especially under Recast Asylum Procedures Directive. And there are still questions about whether the returns from Greece to Turkey comply with international law. So this is the international law aspect of it. But there's also a very pragmatic problem with this return component of the statement. It is that in the Q&A of the website of the European Commission is that what are the legal basis of the returns from Greece and Turkey, from Greece to Turkey? You will realize that EU Commission answers to this question. It is the EU-Turkey readmission agreement and Greece-Turkey bilateral readmission agreement. So, because of the tensions between the EU and Turkey, and Greece and Turkey, Turkish foreign minister has declared both of these agreements suspended in the last years. So, for returns today, there is no valid legal basis for returning rejected asylum seekers from Greece to Turkey, and this is a quite important problem because these returns are now de facto. Okay, so there are no procedural safeguards except those in the EU law. We don't know if they're implemented properly. So my lesson, which can be drawn from this, is return and removal and readmission should not be positioned at the center of supranational migration and asylum laws and management instruments, because returning and readmitting a large number of rejected asylum seekers is neither viable nor realistic, because we all know there are quite important problems with readmission and return of persons from the EU. And finally, there is an important question mark about the statement, is that there is very little data on what's happening on the ground. The EU Commission, as I mentioned, publishes the implementation reports, but the last report, as I have checked, and fact sheet, was published a year ago. So we don't know in the last year what is happening on the ground in relation to the EU-Turkey statement. And this is all one-sided, because the EU Commission always glorifies the outcome and presents the deal as something which has decreased the number of irregular arrivals, but it doesn't mention any human rights implications of the statement. There is also no objective review mechanism or supervision mechanism which investigates shortcomings or misconducts taking place during the implementation of the statement. So a lesson drawn from this might be, for future deals or instruments with third countries, objective and up-to-date data should be published, and objective and reliable monitoring, supervision, and accountability mechanisms should be introduced. And this is the point, I think, of Catherine from the last panel. So you might ask, okay, these are the whole really bad side of the EU-Turkey statement, and there are serious problems with it, but is it all bad? Now, I would argue, from a Turkish scholar, seeing the impact of the EU-Turkey statement on the ground, there are very few positive outcomes, and these are the projects and programs funded by the EU to improve protection of refugees in Turkey. Let me give you a few examples. One of these projects funded by the EU and implemented by the Turkish authorities is the CTTE program. So this program offers economic support to Syrian families in return to make sure their children are attended to school. So this proved to be quite an important and successful project, because we see that the Syrian children's attendance at school in primary education is quite good, but then when you go to middle school and high education, high school, their attendance really gets low. So this program has improved access of Syrian students, in particular girls, to education in Turkey. And this is also one of the good practices in relation to Global Compact on Refugees that Turkey presents. The second project which can be identified here is the programs to construct more kindergartens, primary schools, and public education centers under the Facility for Refugees in Turkey program, the FRIT2. And these also contribute to access of Syrian children to education. A notable project can be identified as the EESSM Cash Assistance Program, which is implemented with Turkish Crescent. And this gives Syrian refugees a debit card, and every month the debit card is deposited a certain amount of financial assistance. So Syrian refugees can themselves spend money on whatever they wish, and this contributes to the economic independence of Syrians in Turkey. And finally, we can identify the Sıhhat project, which translates to well-being in Turkey. So this is implemented with the Turkish Ministry of Health and WHO. So under this project, more than 180 migrant health centers were established. And in these centers, Syrian doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals work with translators. So this facilitates access of Syrians in Turkey to healthcare, free healthcare. And these can be identified as quite perhaps successful programs, which are included to the good practices of Turkey in relation to GCR. These are also as part of Turkey's pledges under the Global Compact on Refugees, in particular continuing these programs. But what I will argue that though these are quite, can be identified positive outcomes of the EU-Turkey statement, the problematic aspect is that EU funded these projects in return for Turkey's readmission of rejected asylum seekers and returning people and preventing further arrivals to Turkey. What I argue that the EU should continue funding these projects, but the conditionality of this deal, I mean, the carrot-sticks approach should end. So the EU should continue funding these projects because if refugees, asylum seekers can access decent protection standards in Turkey, they would be willing to stay there, not risk their lives to cross in dinghy boats to Greece or to move on to Europe. So my argument is that these programs and projects should continue, but they should not be condition Turkey deterring new arrivals or readmitting those who have managed to reach the member state territories by risking their lives. And this is my take on the EU-Turkey deal. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Meltem, for your take on the EU-Turkey statement, for pointing out, providing an overview of the key legal issues that have characterized the statement, but also the intended and unintended consequences of the statement, both in Turkey and in Greece, and also for pointing out to the positive aspects in terms of projects that were implemented under the EU facility with Turkey that represents one of the positive aspects of EU cooperation over the previous year, in spite of the containment, overall containment approach of the statement. So I would like now to give the floor to our fourth speaker, Mehari Tadele Maro, professor at the Migration Policy Center in Florence. Mehari, in your contribution in the ASILE Forum, which, by the way, now is also a book published by the European University Institute, you can download it on the ASILE website. You focus on the EU-Africa migration diplomacy, and you describe the main, together with Andrew Geddes, you describe the main features of on which diplomatic relations between the EU and African countries have been built, and you also point to some gaps that need to be addressed in order to build a more effective partnership between the EU and African countries. So this is particularly relevant in light of, in particular in light of the new pact, which calls for mutually beneficial partnership. So we are very interested to have your intervention on this aspect. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Roberto, and also thank you for having me. I want to build on what Meltem, Nick, and Thomas have said. I think they were excellent presentations, and I think in many ways they overlap with some of the conclusions that Andrew and I tried to provide in that paper. Let me focus on about 4 points in this presentation. The first is that there is an understanding, and I see with all the presentations we heard, the issue of containment, all kinds of containment of migration from Africa, which has also a lot of variation and difference in many ways, not all, not to be treated as one country, or there are various interests and different interests on migration, but the cost to human rights, the cost to normative framework within Africa even, the cost to integrative projects in Africa has been huge because of the containment. And we try to discuss that one to an extent. And the second point is on the focus on refugees and local integration as a solution. And that has come a long way now. The European policy on this is that encouraging local integration through financial instruments and diplomatic instruments. And that has, I think, paid in some cases where local integration is becoming an important point. And this goes to the presentation Thomas has made, in a way, sedentarism within regional contexts. And there are countries that are very famous and actually appreciated globally as a host nations like Ethiopia and Uganda. The third point is return and readmission and its conditionalities. Whether that is effective or not, I think Meltem has pointed precisely things that could be transposed the same conclusion in African context, what is happening in Turkey, that return and readmission is flawed in general, that it imposes something that countries in Africa should not take a risk. And Thomas precisely mentioned Ethiopia's case, for example, where laissez-passes cannot be issued to individuals when they don't claim it, actually. They don't claim it. I have been to different countries of destination in Europe and in the Middle East, especially Israel, where refugees who have claimed asylum are not willing to go back, and they don't want to take the laissez-passer from the embassies, while there are immigration officials located there and they have been deployed for this purpose, and individuals are not willing to take. And the embassies say, we cannot force them to take these laissez-passes because we don't know whether they are Ethiopians or not. And when this adds to a situation where you have conflict, it is even worse, if you wish. And it becomes a security concern for some countries. Now, if you see also the duties and burden sharing, financially focused only from European side, the issue of resettlement, the talk of human rights, and also generally responsibility sharing becomes lost. So in general, if you see the basic elements of international law and obligation, the right to asylum, refugee protection, non-refoulement, has been seriously affected by the arrangement we see with third countries in African context. We know, for example, most refugees hosted in Africa, close to 39% of the total global population of refugees are hosted in Africa, more than 33 million we have now. And one of the questions that come is these countries are hosting these refugees on behalf of the international community. There should be burden sharing or responsibility sharing, and poor countries, poor host communities are paying a lot. An example is Uganda, which was generous, but recently there is a lot of pressure, especially on ownership of land, use of land by communities that share kin communities across border. Now it is being stressed a lot, and there is a need for more assistance in this regard, but that doesn't come. Even the cost is not assessed. The cost to poor host countries that we have, or communities, host communities, the cost of refugees, hosting refugees. Now, we know the EU policy, for example, the recent pact, I think, which was alluded by some of the speakers, that support to host refugees and host communities is a very important element, which is interesting, that is coming. Even if the end objective or end state of that kind of policy direction may be sedentarism or containment, but I think it's an important element. I really appreciate that there should be a lot of support on hosting refugees, to those that are hosting refugees and the host communities themselves. And in recent years, we see an increasing level of support. And I think, if I am not mistaken, Meltem said and alluded to this, that those kind of support do contribute to overall resilience and support system to the refugees in the host countries, and they should be continued. The issue of economic opportunity, providing economic opportunity, especially to the youth, through employment and others, is an important element of the containment. despite that it is still in containment, but it's not something also the worst kind that should be continued in significant way, which is the second key approach that the EU has endorsed in the new pact. Fighting smuggling, return and readmission, and legal migration are the most difficult ones. First, fighting smuggling is not really fighting smuggling. It is Frontex moving to Africa, basically, and taking charge of some of the sovereign acts of states through diplomacy, migration diplomacy, and financial. And it is hardening borders, which has been soft in Africa. Even informal movements of people have been hampered because of borders are now, governments are influenced or pushed, or the policies are shaped so that these entities which didn't have the purview on the border areas in general are forced to take more charges and affecting even traditional movements that doesn't affect Europe at all. Or hardening of these border areas could affect free movement of persons in general. That is an effort to add integrative projects in Africa for a long time. And this costs us a lot of lives, like we have seen in the case of the presentation Meltem did. And we have figures where missing and dead migrants are increasing, partly because of this, or the suffering of migrants in the hands of militias who have de facto control of some of the detention centers, which are black holes in international law. And they are black holes because they are not under the purview of anyone for accountability purpose or even constituency representation in some of the countries like Libya, where you have state failure. The same could be talked about return and readmission. What is effective, what rate is effective is judged by European Union differently, as one would assess if this kind of return and readmission are put as a success. I think European Union in this regard is putting all eggs in one basket when it talks about return and readmission and how it assesses its own effort as successful. It's almost self-fulfilling prophecy, if you wish. On the legal migration, still much is deserved. We are yet to see data clearly, and there are a lot of mismatches of expectation and impact. And this legal migration is linked to conditionalities that I think it will be very difficult to assess later on, because conditionalities are not easy instruments of enforcement or behavior, taming behavior, if you wish. So I think the prominence of criminal justice, border control, is determinant. It's a detriment to Africa's interest in many ways, we see. Now, also, even if local integration is preferred, which one cannot oppose fully, but the issue of resettlement, burden sharing, or responsibility sharing is very important. Let me give you one example where you have in our paper also talk and a broader, a larger project that we have been working on Ethiopia and Uganda and Rwanda, the cost of hosting refugees. And there you have Ethiopia, which has changed amended its refugee law. That was long-standing refugee law. Amendment was needed. It's not to say there should not be amendment, but the amendment was done from one perspective only: European migration diplomacy and financial influence. And the change doesn't really take into consideration the local host community's interest in terms of employment and so on. It's not really big. Industrial parks, for example, a percentage of industrial jobs in industrial parks in Ethiopia has been allocated. About more than 10,000 hectares of land in some places have been allocated for refugees, where you have huge land is the biggest resource, national resource in the country, and it has been a source of contention like elsewhere in Africa as the only resource for many agrarian community. Infrastructure, education, health developments are included, but very important in that regard. Now, so those admissions of stranded migrants from Libya in Rwanda, which is a gesture, a hospitality gesture, which is very important to be appreciated. These are critical in many ways that are important. In Uganda also we see that. But the point I want to make, the last point, is that the factors that are important for successful partnership with the third country, in Africa especially, has to focus on three things. First is the type, the political regime type, and domestic politics has to be taken into consideration. Without that, the cost-benefit analysis that political actors and others will conduct will affect the success of those partnerships, if you wish. Second, the level of financial support has to come clear in a way that offsets the risks that are associated to taking this all, and the cost that host communities and host countries take into consideration. And ultimately also it has to take a third point, is the Pan-African projects that we have, whether it undermines those, because the European Union is supporting on the one hand this kind of projects through many financial instruments, but it's undermining it on the issue of migration, because the migration core defining policy of Europe now is not value. It is in its interest, very, very narrow interest on controlling and containment based on the threat that is considered as a socio-cultural threat Europe faces, which Africa doesn't internally face as much as Europe. That has to be balanced. The value interest balance has to be made, that delicate balance has to be made. Thank you. I'll stop here, and maybe later on in the exchange, I could bring some points that are left. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Meari, for your very rich presentations, for really touching some the core issue of the need. What does it mean to have balanced and comprehensive partnership? And you pointed out very well the risk that indeed positive developments when using development assistance to support countries hosting refugee may be offset and counterbalanced by this insistence and this focus on containing mobility, which is in itself one of the major issues to ensure that sustainable solutions may be achieved. So thanks a lot for this. We came to a conclusion of our first round of presentations. I would like now to immediately turn to our discussants. I would like, of course, to ask our discussant to focus on some on the issues, of the main issues that have been raised by our speakers, but you can also feel free to add any additional aspects or point that you may find relevant based on your current research. So I would like to start with our first discussant, Tsione Tadesse Abebe, senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in Addis Ababa. So just to introduce your intervention, in your contributions for the ASILE book on the new pact, Tsione, you argue that the new pact and the EU agenda in African countries risk threatening Africa-EU partnership more broadly. So we are very interested to listen your intervention. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Roberto. Good afternoon, all panelists and the audience that has joined us this afternoon. First, I would like to thank the ASILE Forum for inviting me to share my perspectives in this important conference. And I will focus on the external dimension of the EU Migration Pact, of course, and especially with respect to Africa. And I draw my reflections from chapter 19 of the just published ASILE book. The chapter is titled, "The New Pact's Focus on Migrant Returns Threatens Africa-EU Partnership," and is co-authored by my colleague Emmanuel and myself. And my discussion will specifically look at key issues raised by Meari and Thomas in their today's intervention, as well as their published chapters in the book, since they cover the external dimension of the pact with a specific focus on Africa. Thomas discussed the strong dependence of the externalization dimension of the EU Migration Pact on cooperation with third countries. And Andrew and Mahari, in their joint chapter, also state that the external dimension has become particularly relevant in relation to migration from African countries. And here, I would like to highlight that it's quite important to know third countries means African countries in this context, because under the European Commission's 2016 new partnership framework, 13 of the 16 priority countries are in Africa, and these include Ethiopia, Nigeria, Senegal, and Algeria. In this respect, Emmanuel and I argue that returns towards Africa are the primary focus of the externalization dimension of the pact, which is aimed at rebuilding trust and developing workable compromises within the European Union's 27 states. And in relation to migration, as you all know, informing returns is one of the few unifying topics among EU member states. Here, the fundamental question is, why is the focus on Africa? Because Africans make up a small minority of asylum seekers within the EU member states, and asylum claims by other nationals, including Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis, and more recently, Venezuelans and Colombians, far exceed those of Africans. Further, overall arrivals, border crossings to EU member states have dramatically decreased since 2015. So why the focus on Africa? Andrew and Mahari, as well as Thomas, provide important explanations here. According to Andrew and Mahari, the long-standing tendency of the EU and its member states to view Africa as a potential source of large-scale migration to the EU is part of the reason, driven by conflict, income and wealth inequalities, and demographic changes, compounded by the consequence of the climate crisis. On the other hand, Thomas explains that the externalization dimension towards Africa is driven by a strong assumption of European states that effective return sends a strong message that discourages irregular migrants. In relation to this point, the chapter by Emmanuel and I argues that this kind of thinking misses the point that those who undertake extraordinary risks do so because they have to do it. This is regardless of whether we call them refugees or irregular migrants. And interestingly, there is no evidence to substantiate the claim that a country's willingness to accept forced returns will result in a high number of returns or deter future arrivals. In fact, our chapter explains that accepting returnees is politically difficult for many African countries, since cooperating with the EU member states or any other country for that matter on forced returns can hurt their legitimacy. As much as the European states want to send a strong message to their constituencies that they are tough on migrants, African governments would also like to avoid being branded as facilitators of deportation of their own citizens. And some of the experiences of African countries that cooperated on return and readmission show a very strong backlash, as exemplified by the experience of Mali, which was forced to withdraw from the returns deal due to a public outcry. And the issue of sovereignty discussed by Thomas in his chapter is critical here. In his chapter, he highlighted that the European perspective views the right to control migration as inherently driven by the question of European state sovereignty. This attitude partly drives European states' expectation of third countries, African countries, to prevent migration through their territory towards Europe. This approach doesn't recognize the same need and priority of African states linked to their own sovereignty. Related to this, our chapter argues that such an approach is contrary to Africa's position and could affect other important negotiations between the two continents, such as the post-Cotonou Partnership Agreement and the Africa-EU strategy negotiations. It also clashes with the recent narrative of partnership of equals by the European Union with respect to particularly the EU-Africa strategy negotiations. And I would like to conclude by highlighting few points on the way forward, drawing a couple of points from what has been highlighted by Andrew and Mahari, and also mentioned in his intervention by Mahari a few minutes ago. One, the need for African approaches to move from migration management to migration governance. Here, nationally owned, politically led migration governance is central. And it's also equally important to move away from the criminal justice system focused approach that emphasizes addressing irregular migration and prosecution of traffickers and smugglers. These 2 points strongly support the call by our chapter, by Emmanuel and I, on the African Union and its member states to remain focused on their priority, which is Africa's regional integration agenda, which includes implementation of African Continental Free Trade Area and expansion of the free movement of persons regime to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth, good governance, peace, and security. Thank you, and back to you, Roberto.
Thanks a lot, Sion, for your intervention and really for outlining very well indeed this fundamental divergence in interest between African and European interest, and the need also for some fundamental priorities that are supported by African countries to be considered when framing broader EU-African relations. So thanks a lot. I turn now to our second discussant, Amanda Bison, Policy Officer at the European Centre for Development Policy Management. In your contribution for the book, Amanda, you focus on EU-African relations, and you present an interesting case study, which is Nigeria, and you focus on the impact of few policies on that country. So we are very interested to listen from you your views on EU external action impacts. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to listen to everyone in this panel today. I think most of the contributions have been very insightful, and I will speak on my chapter, but I'll also try to respond to some of the contributions from the presenters, from the earlier presenters. So what I looked at in my chapter was the externalization of EU migration policies in the case of Nigeria specifically, and seeing how these measures are now affecting practices and policies in the Nigerian society. I think one of the first things I will refer to here is the presentation by Nick, where he spoke about the increasing informality of EU arrangements with third countries. And this is what we see in the case of Nigeria. So clearly, Nigeria has a common approach on mobility and migration signed with the EU. And the EU has, for several years, been attempting to sign a readmission agreement with Nigeria, unsuccessful until now. But this doesn't stop the cooperation between the EU and Nigeria on migration issues, particularly focusing on containment, on returns, and on readmission. So in the paper, I gave an example of one of the direct changes that we can see when it comes to national migration legislation and practice, where several persons were arrested by the Nigerian Immigration Service for attempting to migrate illegally from Nigeria to Europe through Niger. Now, if you look at the criminal code or the penal code of Nigeria, there is no provision for that. Also, if you look at the Immigration Act, there is no provision for that. So it was quite interesting how the government lawyers creatively found a provision under the Immigration Act of evading migration check and immigration check and immigration controls, and somehow couched it in the legal process as trying to migrate irregularly from Nigeria to Europe, and that was one of the counts on which those people were arrested and arraigned in the Federal High Court in northern Nigeria. So we increasingly see that this externalization we talk about, it's not just in terms of relationships between countries or at the policy level. We also see it practically changing certain legislations, changing certain practices, also at the national level. But then when you look to the legal basis or try to understand on what basis this externalization is founded, then you don't see any agreements, like I think Nick would have found in his research. So this is one of the interesting points. Again, I think another point that I've heard from this discussion is this focus on containment. And I think it's interesting to look at what it means for different stakeholders here. So what does it mean for African states at the regional level, this focus on containment? Because if we look at the regional level, example, in the case of Nigeria, in ECOWAS, Nigeria has regional commitments to ensure the free movement of persons in the region based on the ECOWAS free movement protocol. But what does this containment focus do? It is such that the free movement protocol is no longer being respected by certain member states, or is being to a large extent ignored, or technically in some areas being frustrated. I mean, if you have to cross 20 border or immigration checks before you get to the actual border crossing, that is one way also of trying to frustrate the implementation of this free movement protocol. So you see that regional commitments are equally being undermined. And if you look at the national level to see what this means for some states, I think Tion has already alluded to the point that most West African states in particular do not want to be seen as cooperating with the EU on readmissions, or as cooperating with the EU on returns, because it's costly for them also with the domestic population. Again, in the paper, I gave an example of Edo State, which is one of the states in Nigeria where you have a large proportion of migrants originating from, but also you see that these migrants are very instrumental in the political decisions made in the states, because at the last government or state level elections in Edo, the gubernatorial candidates actually reached out to the diaspora, who consist of both regular and irregular migrants, if you look at it through the lens of the EU. And these migrants were quite instrumental in ensuring and engaged also politically in ensuring that certain outcomes were achieved in the state. And afterwards, the governor also reached out to the diaspora to say, thank you very much for your support. And as a result of your support, I will ensure that XYZ measures are taken in the state to encourage remittance flows and other things that are of importance to migrants. So there are different positions here that African states adopt, as opposed to the European states who look at these issues from a very different perspective. And I think that Tion in her discussion has highlighted some of these different perspectives. But one other thing I would like to come back to that Thomas spoke about was also re-examining the foundations of international law. I think when we look at this focus on containment, and we look at how generally the trend is moving now towards excluding without justification, we can also see, if we go a few years back to look historically, we can also see that this wasn't quite the norm and is now increasingly being changed and becoming the norm. And also we see that this has an effect on the positions adopted by African countries. And so the question for me, and I think to Thomas also, would be, how can we re-examine these foundations, and how can we ensure that African concepts or African norms when it comes to international law are also being included in these principles? Because Eurocentric views cannot just be the basis of the foundation for international law principles that apply not only to Europe, but globally. How can we also ensure that African norms and African principles are taken into consideration at this level? And also, I think one other thing that has been mentioned in this conversation has been the focus on, or the lack of focus on the human rights of migrants and the evasion of responsibility. Clearly, in the case of Nigeria, what we see is this evasion of responsibility and trying to change certain practices through capacity building measures. So capacity building measures carried out by international organizations are targeted at implementing some of these externalization practices, and they aim to change some of the norms that do exist in the region. An example would be the definition of irregular migration. Now, if you look at the ECOWAS, or also expulsion of citizens within the region, and if you look at the ECOWAS protocols, they have certain standards and provisions regarding what a state should do in terms of expelling a migrant or from another ECOWAS member state. However, if we look at the capacity building measures that are being given by some of these international organizations to national agencies, they do not look or stress this these regional provisions. Actually, what they do is look at other international law or other European regulations to say, well, this is the basis for you to expel such a person from your state if the person is considered an irregular migrant. But then the question is always, how can you consider an ECOWAS citizen moving within ECOWAS with the necessary identification and irregular migrants still when the person is within the ECOWAS territory? And that is one question that has not been answered. I'll summarize here. Thank you very much, Roberto, for your reminder. But I think that in my main summary, I'd want to just finalize with the point that, two main points. One is the fact that when we look at certain practices, they try to push things out of sight, and this leads to an abdication of responsibility. And Mehari mentioned the detention centers, which is one practical example of this. And secondly, my final point would be the fact that we see little steps, especially when it comes to legal pathways and other measures that Meltem referred to. These are little steps and little progresses that are being made. But in general, if one looks at the outcome or the impact of some of these measures, we see that there is a general lowering of international standards. There is also a general lowering of some of the regional and in Africa, even continental standards in terms of, these are some of the implications actually of these externalization policies. Well, my final point would be not to end on this bleak note, but to ask what really we can do to change this status. And my question goes to the presenters.
Thanks a lot, Amanda, for your very rich presentation, for indeed taking as a case study in Nigeria, pointing out to how many aspects that were also raised by some intervention are also relevant for that case, and how also EU policy initiatives can impact on the legal and policy system of that country, and also on regional frameworks for free movement, such as the one of the enshrining the ECOWAS Treaty and its free movement protocol. So I would like now to turn to our last discussant, Eleni Karageorgiou from Lund University. In your contribution, Eleni, you define Greece as the EU asylum policy laboratory. So the EU-Turkey statement and the hotspot approach have indeed put Greece in front of major operational challenges and also legal challenges. So it's a case in which an external instrument has indeed impacted heavily also on an EU member states that was asked to implement and on to bear the consequences of that instrument. So Eleni, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for this introduction, and of course many thanks to all SEP's team for putting together such a fascinating conference. I'm grateful for the invitation to join this panel together with good friends and esteemed colleagues, and mindful of the time constraints, I will be brief. I will basically draw on a few key points raised by the panelists that speak to my own research, and that is the role of solidarity within the context of externalization of EU migration and asylum policy, which to some extent, of course, relates to my contribution to the ASILE Forum. So what is clear from all presentations of this panel is that cooperation with third countries is a core element of the EU migration and asylum policy, a core element of the EU Pact, and I would say also the modus operandi in the refugee context globally, as presentations from yesterday on the African and South American context have shown. So today I will leave aside the well-documented critique towards safe third country practices as responsibility shifting schemes, contrary to international solidarity. And I will rather focus on how solidarity is being narrated and how this shapes refugee protection in general, perhaps adding a few thoughts on the brilliant discussion by speakers this morning. So it is interesting to look at the language of the pact, the language of solidarity, the language of partnership and mutual benefits, which based on the presentations of this panel seems to be a euphemism for a rather coercive approach to cooperation, which ignores realities on the ground, ignores different and sometimes competing interests and priorities, as pointed out by Amanda, by Gion, and it also undermines certain conceptual and normative approaches to migration and mobility over others, as demonstrated by Thomas. It is worth noting that in the Commission staff working document accompanying the new Asylum and Migration Management Regulation, it is stated that the main problem with readmission agreements so far is that they have not been used to their full potential. This is what the Pact aims to tackle. In the Pact, it is stated that the EU should draw on, and I quote, the experience and privileged relationships of some member states with key partners, end of quote, which is, to my mind, a milder version of the way the Commission presented the idea of a new partnership framework back in July of 2016, where it was stated that the special relationship that member states may have with third countries, reflecting political, historic, and cultural ties fostered through decades of contacts, should be exploited to the full for the benefit of the EU. That is the end of quote. So along the same lines, the then president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, has stressed in the State of the Union address in 2017 that solidarity cannot be an exclusively intra-European affair. a statement mirrored in several European Commission documents concerning measures implementing solidarity under the European Agenda on Migration, including readmission agreements. So Juncker held that we must sow solidarity with Africa, a statement which he repeated in 2018. Africa does not need charity, it needs true and fair partnerships. And Europe needs these partnerships just as much. So the EU measures and readmission agreements, including the EU-Turkey deal, cooperation with Niger, Tunisia and Libya, and also cooperation with Nigeria as presented by Meltem, Nick, Amanda, appear to precisely legitimize Europe's interference with domestic matters in other parts of the globe, and interference, of course, with the right of movement of individuals on the territory of non-EU countries in a kind of a neo-colonial manner. As Mehari claimed, responsibility sharing is totally lost within this context, right? So what do we have? We have a continuation of containment and a continuation of unevenness, of this asymmetry, so to say. So unfortunately, as very well pointed out by Meltem, there are lessons that have been not learned from the application of the EU-Turkey statement. The Commission does not seem to share the understanding that the statement was not effective. Instead, the European Commission identifies the problem in the fact that returns have actually failed. In other words, the EU-Turkey statement did deliver in terms of containment of refugees to first country of asylum, which is either neighboring countries to the EU, such as Turkey, or first countries of asylum in the EU, like frontline EU member states. But it did not really deliver in terms of readmission, of returning people back to Turkey. So in light of this, solidarity is now, through the pact, appropriated for use in the context of deportation, and return sponsorship has been considered as giving effect to solidarity as provided for in EU treaties. Interestingly enough, solidarity in its external dimension appears in the negotiations between the European Commission and EU countries located at the external borders. In a joint statement after a summit of the so-called Med5 in Athens this past weekend, the Interior and Migration Ministers of Greece, Italy, Spain, Cyprus, and Malta said that in its current format, the pact does not provide sufficient reassurances to the frontline member states. And the reaction to that by Vice President of the Commission, Margaritis Schinas, was that Europe is working on the renewal of the agreement with Turkey and of similar agreements with countries in North Africa. So the objective is to reassure the European South that migration management begins already outside Europe's territorial borders. Solidarity, according to Commissioner Schinas, presupposes actually strong border control policy and new dynamic agreements with third countries. Perhaps here we should remind ourselves that it was precisely the failure of intra-EU solidarity and relocation that led the EU to institutionalize responsibility shifting to states outside Europe, compensating with solidarity measures, mainly of financial nature. So the EU-Turkey deal, the Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, mostly concerned with development, migration policy and security, are indicative of the EU focus on the link between solidarity and border management, and also of a conceptualization of self-interest driven solidarity, as was mentioned already by the panelists, allowing for contributions and also for people, for refugees to be traded between the EU and third countries. So in this context, solidarity has provided a vocabulary for each actor to pursue their own agendas, a technocratic vocabulary for the EU to pursue its agenda of deterrence, a vocabulary for EU states to instrumentalize national authorities and local populations to halt migration movements, and also a vocabulary for transit countries to shirk their international responsibilities. What I found very insightful was an intervention recently by Obiora Okafor, the UN independent expert on human rights and international solidarity, and also a renowned human rights scholar, who reflected on the international commitment to protecting refugees. He expressed his concern about the risk of the global refugee regime being subverted by a sharper turn, not just to less and less solidarity, but towards a phenomenon that he refers to as de-solidarity. So that is a condition of not merely a failure to express solidarity or the tendency to abusively deploy it, as we've discussed already, but the increasing tendency to question solidarity in and of itself as a conception, as a praxis, as an obligation. So I would be interested in perhaps listening to whether the speakers see this risk of de-solidarity and the extent to which this may perhaps assume a larger role in the global refugee protection discourse in the future. Another point worth raising is the relationship between pragmatism and solidarity, because the pact has been presented as advancing a pragmatic and realistic approach to solidarity, taking many legitimate interests into considerations and thus striking a new balance to or between responsibility and solidarity. So my question is, can we have it both, pragmatism and solidarity? Because to me, it seems that hiding behind the pragmatic approach, the Commission evades objections at a kind of meta level, right? How is the future of the common European asylum system envisioned, and what do we want solidarity to achieve? So these questions require, I suppose, reimagining the European asylum system as a legal construct, but also solidarity and migration governance in a different way. And we need to critically explore the power hierarchy of the EU and its method of top-down governance, which create a distance between EU institutions, citizens and non-citizens, and also create circumstances of negative solidarity. And I think that this speaks to the message conveyed mainly by Amer and others this morning, the need for a bottom-up approach, decentralized planning, and encouraging decision-making by localities, right? And the role of solidarity in this. So just to conclude, in the "nothing for us without us" very powerful statement by Gregor Knoll, it seems appropriate to think and perhaps to rethink of what this us comprises. And I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Eleni, for this, for your interventions, for the underlying this need for pointing out to this contested nature of solidarity, the need to reflect on the scope and nature of this concept. What does it mean for different institutional actors, and also its potentially exclusionary dimension if it is used as a way to if it is instrumentalized to pursue narrow policy objectives. So it was great to have your last intervention. I think we have still 20 minutes left for our interactive discussion, which means that we need to be quite careful in timekeeping. I would suggest to give the priority to the questions we have received in our chat, and then there will of course be time for our speakers to intervene on specific points. But I would like to make sure that the questions that are raised by the audience are addressed. So I will start with the first question from Mojib Rahman Atal, a question which is addressed specifically to Nick. The question is about the role of development aid in Africa and the Middle East. The question asks, to what extent development aid is used as an instrument to force third countries to cooperate on migration issues? So, and now this is different, current practices are different from the past. Indeed, we have discussed about the language of the new pact on addressing root causes, and the role that development funding has come to play in this field. So I would like to start. I would like to ask Nick if he has any specific comment on this question.
Thanks, Roberto, and thank you, Mojib, for the question. First, I should say that I think my colleagues may be even better placed than I to provide a comprehensive answer, but a couple of quick observations. The first, of course, is that it's often difficult to prove causation between development assistance on the one hand and migration control and containment measures on the other. Often these negotiations take place in diplomatic settings, and it's simply difficult to know what parties may or may not have agreed to. That being said, I think it's worth pointing out that the GCR does, I mean, a really major sort of contribution of the GCR is essentially to marry development assistance and refugee assistance. So it wouldn't be surprising if we saw an increased sort of hybridization of development assistance for migration and refugee related matters. I think it's also worth mentioning that with respect to both Serbia and Turkey, European funding has flowed under pre-accession instruments, of course, which is not the same as development assistance, but somehow related. And finally, of course, it seems worth pointing out from my vantage point in Denmark, that Denmark is proposing the extraterritorialization of both asylum processing and protection to a as yet unnamed third country, and certainly intending to use Danish development assistance funding to fund the entire operation. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick, for this comment. We have Sergio Carrera, which is addressed to Thomas, and the question says, the Strasbourg Court speaks of a right of states to manage migrants. I did not know that states have right. The ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, only speaks of individuals' human rights. Can you please develop on the very existence of this right? In the same line, what do you think of the Strasbourg Court approach to insist on own individuals' conduct to assess if applicants are worthy of ECR protection in cases of pushbacks? Where has the court taken that from? So, Thomas, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Before directly answering Sergio's question, I want to share my screen for 10 seconds with you, because the Commission insists that cooperation must be with third countries must be based on realism. So I think facts are important. I want to share some facts with you on the EU-Turkey statement. This is a graph showing the number of people crossing the Aegean. The peak is in October 2015. The red line is the moment when the EU-Turkey deal was made. So if we want to be realistic, we have to admit that the EU-Turkey deal, logically speaking, cannot possibly have been the cause of the decrease, because the decrease had already happened. And according to basic logic, which even very small children understand, is that the cause has to precede the effect. And here, the effect precedes the cause. So the idea that the EU-Turkey deal was successful and therefore has to be replicated is, well, if you want to be realistic, it's not the way to go. On the typically, it's not just European. Audrey Macklin has pointed out in an article that the idea that states, that in the migration context, states have rights. It seems to be specific for the migration context. It also turns up in the United States and Canada. It's part of a longer story. It was that starts with the Chinese exclusion cases of the US Supreme Court in the 1890s. So they developed this notion that states, as an inherent part of their sovereignty, can exclude foreigners at will. And now that is a typically American, European, Australian thing that is related to the context in which it came up. It's part of the 500-year-old history of international migration law, which I've done work. That essentially, I mean, it sounds a bit woke and politically correct, but international migration law basically holds that Europeans and their descendants can move over the world, and the rest of the world cannot. That's the blunt version. When Europe started colonizing the rest of the world, international lawyers, the founding fathers of international law, discovered a right to go everywhere, which Europeans had and used, and if they were not let in, that was a cause for war, and you could occupy this. This was the legitimation of the migration law, was the legitimation of colonization. It's a long story, and it's not that Europe is not aware that in Africa and the Inter-American Court there are different norms. It's not just that these countries are not cooperating and you can never trust them. They are aware that there are other norms, but they try to make them unimportant, and partly through pure pressure try to make African countries adopt the European perspective, at least formally, and also through capacity building and good governance and what have you. They try to, as if there were evangelists entering Africa. They try to bring this gospel of this European construction of international law that is simply not in Africa's interest. It's not in Africa's interest to go along with the idea that states have rights and individuals have to justify that they want to move. So this is a typically European thing. And as to Amanda's question, what we as researchers can do, we're just researchers. We don't have lots of political power, but what we can do is to make this process visible and to say, well, this is not international law, what the Strasbourg Court says. This is European international law. There are different African and inter-American constructions of international law, which also are not identical. They have a different take on this. This is not, Africans don't get it, or they don't want to cooperate, but they have a different normative idea about how things should be, which comes out of African experiences of migration. And so there's not an African party line or something. Of course, there's conflicts, and different actors have different positions. But it's simply, if Europe pretends it wants to cooperate with Africa, then at least it should acknowledge that there are different normative positions, and it's not misbehavior, but it's a different normative vision of the world. And so what we can do as researchers is to bring that to light, and specifically as European researchers, to give a platform to African researchers to do independent research instead of only do commissioned research for institutions that are working on rolling out their vision that states have a right to control migration. So I think that I very much appreciate this panel for the reason, because it seems to be so well balanced, and it also makes it possible for us to see that Europeans don't necessarily agree and that Africans also don't necessarily agree. But I think this panel is one of the things we can do.
Thanks a lot, Thomas, for this comment. I would like now to give the possibility to Meltem to comment on any of the two questions, but also any other points raised by the discussants that she find relevant. Meltem.
Thank you, Roberto. Well, I would like to thank the discussants and the amazing points that they raised. And I would like to touch upon Eleni's point, is that can we reconcile pragmatism and solidarity, and which one should the EU choose? Well, I think we just previously discussed that the understanding of solidarity in the EU, especially in the new Migration and Asylum Pact of the European Commission, is simply problematic. So what I would like to perhaps just note that the EU's understanding of partnership and solidarity with third countries is quite problematic in a sense that it should be drastically changed to make a meaningful responsibility sharing arrangement in line with the Global Compact on Refugees. Why? I mean, let me give you an example which is outside perhaps of the EU-Turkey statement and not from a recent example. There is 2016 EU Resettlement Framework Regulation proposal, which the objective is to harmonize resettlement procedures and resettlement pledging in the EU. Well, when you look at the 2016 proposal, it has yet to be adopted, but in the new Migration Act, the Commission says we need to adopt this as soon as possible. So it didn't change anything, it's just reaffirmed and said it should be adopted soon. Well, resettlement in the GCR is a pure responsibility sharing and humanitarian tool to protect more people and to give pathway to admission to those in need of international protection. But when you look at this 2016 legislation, you see that it says the Commission and the Council has the authority to prioritize and select regions and countries which resettlement would occur in line with how they cooperate with the EU in the field of migration. And there are sub-paragraphs of Article 3. It says how effective they admit, readmit rejected asylum seekers, how effective they cooperate with the EU in preventing large-scale influx situations. I mean, when you look at that, when you look at the criteria to choose where resettlement would occur in this regulation proposal, you see that resettlement becomes a tool of foreign policy objectives, you know, to reaching EU's foreign policy objectives. But it is not a humanitarian responsibility sharing tool anymore, but it becomes part of EU's larger strategy to externalize asylum and migration policies. I think the EU, to make its policies in line with the GCR and its spirit of responsibility sharing, it needs to start rethinking of the whole partnership with third countries and the solidarity notion, not just intra-EU solidarity, but also its partnership with not just Turkey, but also African countries. Because as long as it says, okay, we will give assistance and money and funding, but it should be only in return if these countries work with us in readmission and prevention of new arrivals. This is quite problematic, not just in terms of international law, but also in terms of the humanitarian nature of refugee law and the tools like resettlement. Yes, that will be all, I think, my comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Meltem. Thanks a lot. I would like now to give the opportunity to Mehari to reply to any of the comments that were raised by the discussant and the audience. Yeah. Mehari, give you the floor.
Thank you so much. I was impressed by what Eleni has said on the issue, the contrast between pragmatism and solidarity at the global level, which is a very important point. And I think that is where, at the heart of the problem with the European migration policy is it is driven mainly and probably exclusively from national interest, whatever that is defined, how that one is defined is for the political systems. But we know socio-cultural threats are considered as important mobilization in the political system we have seen. And the problem with that, as she has said, is that pragmatism, which is devoid of core values, especially human rights values, becomes opportunism, basically. Opportunism to take over and simply without any compass, including moral or legal compass of that sort. And that's what we are seeing. And it's influencing not only European countries, but within Africa also, influencing and reversing old traditional policies, stances, even the absence of policies. In some cases, the absence of policies in Africa, now they are being introduced. And this goes to the point that Thomas had raised. And I tend to slightly differ on this point with Thomas, the fact that the dilemma is there. Clearly, the problem starts, what Thomas has pointed, from the conception of nation state, the introduction of nation state in Africa, and nation state without the capability nor with full appreciation of what nation state means, consequently on the structure. Neither the formation of state is not completed in many African countries, the process of formation of nation state. On the one hand, there was commitment because of colonialism and otherwise past dependence in terms of formation of the nation state. Through instruments, almost all things that we have taken in Africa, including the African Union, regional economic arrangement, and so on, are modeled by the nation state and how nation states interact with each other and so on. Now, on migration, one of the areas where this flawed nation state, imposition of nation state concept in Africa emerges is on migration. Who controls entry and exit? The other state has right to control entry and exit. And by nature, states have that tendency of controlling exit and entry and exit. This flow of information, flow of people, flow of goods, flow of capital, they have that tendency. And many things have made it also necessary to do that. But at the same time, in African context, we have other norms that doesn't go, or realities, if you wish, realities on the ground that doesn't go with this nation state. One example is transnational communities, pastoralist communities, large number of them, or communities that are sedentary, but they are divided into 3 or 4 states. And you end up with having a small house of a household. The bedroom is in Kenya. The living room is in Uganda, in Malabo area. I mean, in Busia area. And the end of that is basically these states do not really consider the reality on the ground. Colonialists have just drawn territories, and the impact is, it is very, very difficult, and it makes it unique in many ways to really deal with this. So on normative framework, we have already adopted many things that are European or Eurocentric. On the reality on the ground, this doesn't match. So it's not only from the law normative framework, but the state structure we are talking about is creating huge challenge. And that's where you have serious problems of implementing migration on informal movements of people, free movement of people that existed now because the European Union intervention in some aspects, they are undermining. And here, if you see in normative framework, the difference is not really there. In reality, there is. How do we bridge this gap is the context where the room, the space for African actors should be given, as it has been said, more to play on that. It's not happening. I can talk on many, on governance, border governance, on other aspects of Pan-African projects that we have, but the impact is huge at normative level. And now it has seeped into the system that it's almost impossible for policymakers to take the risk to contradict those kind of normative diffusion that are happening in Africa, normative setting that is happening in Africa. And that is a big challenge for European itself, because the European system itself, because implementation effectively will be undermined because this is not well grounded on the realities on the ground in Africa. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Meari, for this these concluding comments. I think this intervention is a very good way to conclude our discussion today, as we are now running out of time. I would like to close by thanking all our panelists for their valuable contributions, and also to the participants for actively contributing to the discussion. Thanks also to colleagues at CEPS, Miriam, Chun, and Lina for their support. I would like to wish you a good continuation of the day and invite you to follow our research on our website and social channels. Of course, cooperation with our countries and the same issues we have addressed today are going to remain one of the key research interests that we will address over the following period. So many thanks again to all of you, and all the best.
Thanks, Roberto.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.